When I was 57, my only son sold my house right out from under me, packed up his wife, and moved 2 states away. They left me exactly 150s and a note on the kitchen counter that simply read, "You will figure it out." 15 years later, my grandson looked up my name for a college assignment and phoned me sobbing. Inside of 12 hours, I was staring at 200 missed calls from the son who discarded me like I was nothing. Welcome back to Honor Revenge Stories, where the people who were written off have a habit of writing the final chapter themselves. If this kind of story speaks to you, tap, subscribe that way, the next one comes straight to you, without you having to go looking. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening right now and what time it is there. I love knowing who's keeping me company through these stories. One quick note, some elements of this story have been shaped for audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. 200 missed calls in just under 12 hours. The barrage had not stopped since noon. I lifted the device, feeling the cold metal press against my calloused palms, hands that had labored without rest for decades to construct a life that my own flesh and blood had once stripped from me. I swiped the screen and answered, raising it to my ear without uttering a single word. Ragged, uneven breathing poured through the speaker. Then a voice shattered the silence, young, trembling, drowning in tears. "Grandpa?" The word landed like a blow to the chest. It was Caden. The last time I'd laid eyes on my grandson, he was a 7-year-old boy digging in the dirt of my backyard, completely blind to the monstrous betrayal his parents were engineering inside the house. I stayed quiet, allowing the crushing weight of 15 years of absence to settle between us. "Grandpa, please don't hang up," Caden pleaded, his voice fracturing. "I didn't know. I swear to you I didn't know anything. I was writing a research paper for my university economics class today. My professor told us to profile top philanthropists in the medical technology industry. I typed your name into Google just to see if maybe you were somehow still alive. The Fortune magazine article came up. The medical technology billionaire who donates half his wealth to senior housing initiatives. Grandpa, is that really you?" I shut my eyes and let out a slow, measured breath. The silence of my sprawling top-floor penthouse felt completely cut off from the pandemonium erupting on the other end of the line. "Yes, Caden," I said at last, my voice even carrying the full weight of a 72-year-old man who had clawed his way back from total ruin. "It is me." A sob ripped from the young man's throat. Caden was 22 now, but in that moment he sounded like a child who'd lost his way. "They told me you abandoned us." He wept, the words spilling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "Mom and Dad said you ran off with some woman, that you took all the family money and left us with nothing. But the article said you built your company from the ground up 15 years ago. It said you were left homeless. Grandpa, what did they do to you?" I didn't raise my voice. I had no need to. True power does not require shouting. "Your parents made a choice, Caden," I answered calmly. "They chose to take everything I had, and they chose to lie to you about it. I rebuilt my life from the ashes they left behind. I didn't run, I survived them." I could hear Caden weeping the devastating truth about his parents' nature, bearing down on him all at once. But before he could press me further, the audio on his end went violently muffled. A sudden chaotic scuffle erupted. A door slammed open, followed by a sharp gasp from Caden. "Give me that phone!" A hard, commanding voice cut through the background noise. I could hear Vanessa shouting from somewhere nearby, telling him to put it on speaker. A brief struggle followed the scrape of plastic against skin, and then the line went dead for a fraction of a second before a new voice came through the receiver. It was Derek, my son. The man who had looked me in the eye 15 years ago smiled and quietly sold the roof from over my head. "Dad?" Derek's voice was frantic, breathless, but underneath the manufactured panic, I could detect the unmistakable, nauseating pitch of pure greed. "Dad, is that really you? Oh my God, we have been searching for you everywhere. For 15 years, we have been trying to track you down." My grip on the phone tightened, but my pulse didn't climb. I felt no fear, no sudden surge of paternal warmth, only a cold, precise clarity. The son who had discarded me like a broken tool was now desperate to reconnect. Not because he'd missed his father, because he'd just discovered his father was worth billions. "Dad, please say something," Derek begged, his voice thick with cloying desperation. "My company is in serious trouble. We are facing a massive crisis. And when Caden showed us the article, I couldn't believe it. You have to tell me where you are. We are family, Dad." You have to save us." I listened to his frantic breathing, picturing the panic and greed contorting his face. He was waiting for a lifeline, waiting for the forgiving, guileless father he'd left behind 15 years ago to come rushing to the rescue. But that man was gone. They had buried him the day they pressed a crumpled $150 into his hands. I pulled the phone from my ear, held my thumb over the glowing red icon, and pressed it. The call ended with a sharp, definitive click. I set the phone back down on the polished walnut desk, and the room returned to complete undisturbed silence. The first move had been his. The next one would be mine. The screen of my smartphone lit up the pitch-black darkness of my private study, throwing a pale, hard glow across the polished walnut desk. Beyond my floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline burned like scattered diamonds, a sharp contrast to the dark tide of full memories flooding my mind. My phone was buzzing again, a relentless, insistent tremor, threatening to shake the device right off the table's edge. I settled back in my leather armchair, perfectly still, watching the notifications stack up. 200 missed calls in just under 12 hours. The barrage had not stopped since noon. I picked up the phone, feeling the cold metal against my calloused hands that had worked without pause for decades to build a life my own flesh and blood had once stolen away. I swiped the screen and answered, raising the receiver to my ear without speaking a single word. Ragged, uneven breathing filled the speaker. Then a voice broke the silence, young, trembling, thick with tears. "Grandpa!" The word hit me like something physical. It was Caden. The last time I had seen my grandson, he was a 7-year-old boy playing in the dirt of my backyard, completely unaware of the monstrous betrayal his parents were orchestrating inside that house. I held my silence, letting the dense reality of 15 years of absence settle between us. "Grandpa, please don't hang up," Caden pleaded, his voice collapsing into a sob. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know anything. I was working on a research paper for my university economics class today. My professor assigned us to profile top philanthropists in the medical technology industry. I typed your name into the search bar just to see if maybe you were somehow still alive. The Fortune magazine article came up. The medical technology billionaire who donates half his wealth to senior housing initiatives. Grandpa, is that really you?" I closed my eyes and released a slow, measured breath. The silence of my sprawling top-floor penthouse felt entirely sealed off from the chaos erupting on the other end of the line. "Yes, Caden." I finally said, my voice steady, carrying the weight of a 72-year-old man who had endured absolute ruin. "It is me." A harsh sob ripped from the young man's throat. Caden was 22 now, but in that moment, he sounded like a lost, devastated child. "They told me you abandoned us." He cried, the words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate torrent. "Mom and Dad told me you ran off with some woman, that you took all the family money and left us with absolutely nothing. But the article said you built your company from scratch 15 years ago. It said you were left homeless. Grandpa, what did they do to you?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. True power does not require shouting. "Your parents made a choice, Caden," I replied calmly. "They made a choice to take everything I had, and they made a choice to lie to you about it. I built my life back from the ashes they left me in. I didn't run away. I survived them." I could hear Caden crying, the full devastating weight of his parents' true character collapsing onto him. But before he could ask another question, the audio on his end muffled violently. A sudden chaotic scuffle broke out. A door slammed open, followed by a sharp gasp from Caden. "Give me that phone," a harsh, demanding voice barked in the background. I could hear Vanessa shouting in the distance, telling him to put it on speaker. A brief struggle followed the sound of plastic scraping against skin, and then the line cut out for a fraction of a second, before a new voice came through the receiver. It was Derek, my son. The man who had looked me in the eye 15 years ago smiled and quietly sold the roof over my head. "Dad?" Derek's voice was frantic, breathless, but beneath the manufactured panic, I could hear the unmistakable, sickening register of absolute greed. "Dad, is that really you? Oh my God, we have been looking for you everywhere. For 15 years, we have been trying to track you down." My grip on the phone didn't loosen, but my pulse didn't climb. No fear rose in me. No reflexive surge of fatherly feeling, only a cold, precise clarity. The son who had cast me aside like a spent tool was suddenly desperate to reconnect. Not because he'd missed his father, because he'd just learned his father was worth billions. Dad, please say something. Derek begged, his voice slathered in a cloying, rehearsed desperation. My company is in trouble. We are facing a massive financial crisis, and when Caden showed us the article, I couldn't believe it. You have to tell me where you are. We are family. Dad, you have to save us. I listened to his ragged breathing, picturing the panic and raw greed twisting his face. He was holding out for a lifeline, counting on the forgiving, guileless father he'd left behind 15 years ago to come charging to the rescue. He actually believed that time and shared blood would erase the memory of standing alone in an empty driveway, clutching a pitiful wad of cash while the moving truck pulled away. But that man was gone. They had finished him off the day they pressed a crumpled 150 into his hand and told him to figure it out. Now Derek wanted me to bail out his collapsing real estate business. He wanted the billionaire philanthropist, not the father. I pulled the phone from my ear, held my thumb over the glowing red icon, and pressed it. The call cut off with a sharp, definitive click. I set the phone back down on the polished walnut desk, and the room fell back into complete, undisturbed silence. The first move had been his. The next one would be mine. The heavy doors of my private boardroom clicked shut, sealing us in. Derek didn't bother with pleasantries or hollow apologies. He walked straight to the long glass table and dropped a thick, glossy folder across its surface. It slid and came to rest directly in front of me. I looked at the folder, then up at the man who used to be my son. He was wearing a tailored suit that couldn't quite conceal the desperate perspiration gathering at his temples. He leaned over the table, both palms flat on the glass, and demanded a $2 million loan to rescue his failing real estate development firm. He spoke fast, lobbing around terms like liquidity crisis and temporary market downturns, performing the role of a sharp businessman cutting a deal. But the raw panic in his eyes gave him away entirely. He was going under, and he expected me to be his life raft. I sat back in my chair, hands resting still in my lap, and let him talk. I didn't interrupt. I simply watched the breathtaking audacity play out in front of me. Then Vanessa joined in. She was seated beside him in an expensive silk dress purchased on someone else's dime, legs crossed with a polished elegance that turned my stomach. She leaned forward, her tone starting out with a practiced sweetness that sharpened quickly into accusation. She looked me straight in the eye and declared that while the loan was the pressing matter, we also needed to discuss Caden. She had the nerve to tell me that growing up without his grandfather had taken a real toll on my grandson. In her version of events, my vanishing act 15 years ago had left a deep psychological wound in Caden's life. I was the one who had walked away. She sat there in my room and had the gall to demand that I immediately establish a substantial trust fund for Caden to make amends for my absence during his childhood. The sheer shamelessness of it all settled over the room like a fog. These were the two people who had manipulated me into surrendering my power of attorney while I was still hollow with grief over my late wife. These were the people who had liquidated my home, loaded up their things, and vanished across state lines. They'd left me with a single crumpled $100 bill of $50 and a note telling me to figure it out. Now they were attempting to rewrite the entire story, recasting themselves as the abandoned victims of a neglectful father. I didn't scream. I didn't hurl the folder back at them. The rage inside me wasn't a brush fire. It was a slow, grinding glacier. I looked at the $2 million proposal, then at Vanessa, then at Derek. I let the silence expand 10, maybe 15 seconds. I furrowed my brow slightly and let out a quiet sigh, deliberately giving the impression I was wavering. I made myself look like a tired, guilty old man genuinely wrestling with regret and weighing their absurd demands. That hesitation was a trap, and Derek walked straight into it. Patience had never been his virtue, and desperation had stripped away whatever thin coat of composure he'd had left. He drove his fist down onto the glass table. The sharp crack rang through the room. His face went dark red, and the mask of the desperate but civil businessman shattered completely. He leveled a shaking finger at me, his voice climbing into an ugly, entitled shout. He told me to stop playing games. He yelled that I was 72 years old and had absolutely no use for billions of dollars. He said I was an old man sitting alone in a penthouse while my real family was out there fighting to survive. He leaned close enough that I could see the frantic pulse jumping in his throat, and he spat out the words that sealed his fate forever. He told me I owed them this money. He said I owed them for disappearing all those years ago and leaving them to fend for themselves. That was the moment, the final drop that caused the glass to overflow. He had come to believe his own fabrications. He believed that because I had stayed quiet for 15 years, I was weak. He mistook my silence for surrender. I looked at his flushed, furious face, and I no longer saw my son. I saw a parasite that had finally exhausted every last host. I kept my expression completely blank, holding the lethal trap I was about to spring. The tension inside the private boardroom was thick enough to suffocate. Derek was still hunched over the glass table, face burning with entitlement and panic, waiting for me to simply write a check for $2 million and save his sinking firm. Before I could deliver my answer, the heavy double doors of the boardroom flew open with a violent crash. They struck the wall with a sound like a gunshot that rang through the entire room. Standing in the doorway, chest, heaving eyes blazing with frantic energy, was Caden. He looked as though he'd sprinted straight from his university campus. His heavy backpack slipped from his shoulder and hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud. He didn't so much as glance at me. His tear-filled gaze locked squarely on his parents. "Caden, what are you doing here?" Derek snapped his voice, dropping an octave as he scrambled to cover his desperation with a veneer of parental authority. Vanessa rose immediately, smoothing her expensive silk dress. Her rehearsed smile faltered as she extended a hand toward him. Caden ignored it. He stepped deeper into the room, breath ragged. "My whole life," he said, his voice unsteady but growing stronger with each word. "You told me he abandoned us. You told me he ran off with some mistress and drained our family accounts." Vanessa's face lost its color. Her eyes darted to me, then back to her son. "Sweetheart, please, we can talk about this at home. This is not the time or place for this conversation. Your father and I are trying to conduct very important business." "Business?" Caden let out a short, bitter, heartbroken laugh. "You are here begging him for money. The man you told me was a selfish coward. The man you said left us to starve. I read the articles on the way over here. I checked the dates. He lost everything the exact same month we moved into that big house in the suburbs. You stole from him. You took everything he had." The air went out of the room in an instant. Derek's face twisted into something ugly and cornered. The carefully maintained facade of the struggling but respectable real estate developer evaporated, replaced by a trapped, vicious animal. "Shut your mouth," Derek roared. He crossed the distance to his son in 2 strides and raised his hand. The slap was deafening. The sharp, violent crack of flesh on flesh ricocheted off the high ceiling of the boardroom. Caden stumbled back, his hand flying to his rapidly reddening cheek, eyes wide with shock and betrayal. Vanessa gasped but didn't move a single step toward her son. She just stood there, frozen as her own lies collapsed around her. I didn't think, I just moved. At 72 years old, you might assume my reflexes had dulled, but a grandfather's protective instinct doesn't answer to age. Before Derek could raise his hand to strike his son a second time, I wedged myself squarely between them. I shoved Derek back, with a force that caught us both off guard, sending him stumbling against the hard edge of the glass table. "Do not ever lay a hand on him again," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. The room went dead silent. Derek stared at me, rubbing the spot on his chest where I'd pushed him, breathing hard, eyes darting in every direction. "You have no right to interfere," he spat, leveling a trembling finger at me. "He is my son. You do not get to walk back into our lives after 15 years and tell me how to discipline my own child." I held my ground, keeping Caden sheltered behind my shoulder. I could feel the young man tremble, but he didn't step away. I looked at the man I had raised. In that precise moment, the last thin thread of paternal endurance snapped clean away from my soul. The hesitant, guilt-ridden old man they believed they were playing was gone entirely. Standing in his place was a man who had survived absolute ruin and constructed a billion-dollar empire from nothing. I looked at Derek not with anger, but with a chilling, methodical clarity. The time for observation had passed. The trap was ready to spring. I straightened the cuffs of my jacket, deliberately fracturing the tension with a terrifying glacial calm. I drew a slow breath and moved my gaze from Derek's furious face to Vanessa's pale, hungry eyes. "You are absolutely right," I said, letting the words settle like stones into still water. I owe you both exactly what you deserve for the past 15 years. Derek slowly let his hand fall. His breathing steadied as the word "oh" lit up the parasitic greed wired into his brain. His rage was instantly crowded out by his desperate hunger for my wealth. I returned to my leather armchair, perfectly composed, and regarded them both. Tomorrow night, my foundation is hosting our annual charity gala downtown. I said evenly, my voice carrying the absolute authority of a man holding every card. Every major investor media outlet and industry leader will be in attendance. It is the biggest event of the year for my company. I want you both there. Dress well. Be on time. Caden will be attending as my personal guest. Derek shot a quick calculating look at Vanessa. He swallowed hard, his earlier fury dissolving entirely into desperate, hungry anticipation. And the loan? Derek pressed his voice trembling with renewed hope. The $2 million. I held his greedy, pitiful gaze and gave him a slow, deliberate nod. Tomorrow night I will take the stage, I said. In front of everyone, I will officially announce my decision regarding my successor and the future of my entire fortune. Be there, and you will get exactly what is coming to you. Derek's eyes ignited with a blinding, toxic ambition. A smug, triumphant smile crept across Vanessa's face. They actually believed they had won. They had swallowed the bait whole, hook, line, and sinker with no idea they were strolling straight into their own undoing. The heavy doors clicked shut, absorbing the frantic, desperate energy Derek had dragged into the room. I was alone again. The silence in the penthouse boardroom returned dense and absolute, a stark contrast to the family catastrophe that had just detonated inside it. I didn't sink into my leather armchair. I didn't press my fingers to my temples or mourn the wreckage of my relationship with my son. That grief had been buried 15 years ago. Now there was only the cold, mechanical precision of a man who had just invited a parasite to a feast. I reached for the intercom on my desk and pressed the button. "Hey, send Clifton in," I said. My voice was level emptied of any residual feeling. Within 60 seconds, the doors swung open again. Clifton, my chief legal counsel and head of corporate intelligence, entered the room, a man who moved with quiet efficiency, his face a flawless mask of professional detachment. He carried a thick canvas attaché case which he set carefully onto the glass table, at the very spot where Derek had driven his fist moments before. "You asked me to dig into his company," Clifton said, clicking the case open. "I didn't just dig Gerald, I brought out the heavy machinery." He drew out a substantial stack of confidential financial records, bank statements and court filings, spreading them across the table's surface. I studied the spread of paperwork. Derek had believed he could stride into my office, toss around industry buzzwords, and blind me with a manufactured story about a temporary liquidity crisis. He and his wife had genuinely assumed the man who built a global medical technology empire from bare ground would simply hand over $2 million without running a forensic background check. Clifton pressed a manicured finger against a spreadsheet, flagged in bright red ink. "Your son is not merely weathering a market downturn." Clifton stated, his tone completely flat. "He is broke. In fact, broke would be a significant upgrade from where he actually stands. Derek is drowning in catastrophic criminal debt." I leaned forward, eyes moving across the heavily redacted documents. "For the past 3 years," Clifton continued, "Derek has been running his real estate development firm as a personal treasury. He has been systematically pulling funds from his active residential projects to bankroll a lavish lifestyle designer, close luxury cars, expensive vacations, all paid for with money that was never his. He built a web of fictitious vendor invoices to hide the trail, but he got sloppy. But that is not the worst of it," Clifton said, drawing a second file from the attaché case. The file bore a federal seal along its top margin. 2 months ago, a group of private investors noticed discrepancies in his quarterly reports. They brought in a forensic accounting firm. The auditors found a gaping hole in his corporate accounts. Derek has embezzled $4 million from his own investors. He is currently the subject of an active covert investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The pieces locked into place with crystalline clarity. The frantic phone calls, the sudden urgent need to resurface after 15 years of silence, the aggressive demand for precisely $2 million. Derek hadn't wanted my money to pour into new properties. He needed a massive, immediate infusion of untraceable cash to quietly seal the hole in his accounts before federal agents came through his front door. He was terrified, cornered, and hunting for a shield. He thought he could use the father he had discarded as a human buffer against a federal indictment. I let out a low, humorless laugh. It was a pathetic, spectacular brand of arrogance. He had put me out on the street with $150, fully expecting me to simply fold and disappear. Now staring down the barrel of decades in a federal penitentiary, he expected me to blindly deliver $2 million to rescue him from his own greed. He genuinely believed I was still that same naive, shattered old man from 15 years ago. Clifton gathered the documents and stacked them neatly back into the canvas attaché case. He looked at me, his expression grave. "We have undeniable proof of his financial crimes, Gerald," Clifton said quietly. "The wire transfers, the fake shell companies, the forged signatures. It is all here. Should I contact the authorities right now? We can hand this entire portfolio to the federal investigators and have him taken in before he even gets back to his house." I rose from my chair and crossed slowly to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city below was coming alive, a sprawling lattice of gold and silver pushing out toward the horizon. I looked down at the streets and thought about the magnificent charity gala taking place tomorrow night. I thought about Derek racing home to tell his wife they had successfully worked the old man, that their salvation was locked in. I wanted him to savor that feeling. I wanted him to taste the victory. I wanted him sleeping soundly tonight, dreaming of the billions he was about to inherit. I turned back to Clifton and shook my head, my face an absolute mask of unforgiving ice. "No," I said smoothly. "Do not call the police. Let him put on his expensive suit. Let him walk the red carpet. Let him step up onto that stage and feel the heavy golden crown of victory settle on his head. Because a fall from the bottom step is quickly forgotten, Clifton. I want him to fall from the very top. Only when he is certain he has won everything will we push him off the edge." The bell above the door of the small corner diner chimed softly, cutting through the low hum of the espresso machine. I sat in a booth near the back, nursing a black tea, watching the entrance. Caden walked in. He looked completely drained. The dark circles beneath his eyes and his caved-in posture told the story of a young man whose entire world was coming apart at the seams. He spotted me and threaded his way through the narrow maze of wooden tables. He slid into the booth across from me, eyes fixed on the scarred tabletop between us. I didn't offer a warm smile or a reassuring hand on the shoulder. This was not a family reunion. This was an intervention. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and produced a small silver flash drive. I set it squarely on the center of the table. The metal clinked against the wood, pulling his gaze down. I told him that everything contained on that small device was the unvarnished truth about the people who had raised him. I laid it out plainly. His father was not the victim of a simple market downturn. Derek had embezzled $4 million from his own investors. He had falsified documents, conjured fake vendor accounts, and funneled stolen money to sustain a lifestyle built entirely on excess. I told Caden that his parents weren't seeking a family reconciliation. They were hunting for a human shield to place between themselves and a federal indictment. Caden stared at the flash drive as though it were something venomous. His breathing went shallow. He asked me how they could do something so reckless, how lying could come so easily to them. I looked at my grandson and told him that lying was the simplest thing his parents had ever done. I asked him to picture a 57-year-old man driving home from the cemetery. I had just buried my wife, his grandmother. That house was supposed to be a place of grief and quiet comfort. Instead, I walked up to the front porch and found the door wouldn't budge. My key wouldn't turn. I looked through the window and saw the living room had been gutted. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every trace of a life lived together had been stripped out. I kept my voice perfectly steady as I described the raw, breathless shock of that afternoon. I told him about the single envelope sitting on the doormat. Inside were exactly $150 in crumpled bills and a handwritten note from his father. It said simply to figure it out. They had preyed on my grief at its deepest point. They had manipulated me into signing away my assets while my mind was fogged with sorrow and medication. They took my home, my savings, my only grandson, and drove away across state lines without a single glance back. A heavy, suffocating quiet settled over the small booth. Caden buried his face in his hands. His shoulders heaved as he fought to muffle his sobs. The sheer gravity of the truth was breaking him apart. The comfortable life he'd grown up in, the privilege he had always taken as a given, it had all been constructed on the back of an old man they had left for dead. He whispered that they were monsters. He kept saying it, his voice splintering with revulsion and grief. I didn't disagree. I let him cry. I let the pain of that betrayal burn away the last illusions he had held about his family. It was a brutal thing watching a young man lose his parents while they were still standing, but a surgeon does not hesitate to excise infected tissue. The infection had to come out. I waited until his breathing steadied and he finally dragged his sleeve across his eyes. I leaned forward, forearms resting on the table, and nudged the flash drive a few inches closer to him. I told him that tomorrow night, the entire city would have its eyes on the charity gala. I told him his parents would be seated in the front row, dressed in clothes purchased on my stolen credit line, waiting to be anointed as the heirs to my empire. Then I gave him his mission. I told Caden that just before I took the stage, he needed to take that flash drive and make his way toward the rear exit of the grand ballroom. I told him to look for a tall man in a dark gray suit positioned near the service doors. He was to place the drive directly into that man's hand. Caden looked up at me, his eyes wide and raw. He asked who the man in the gray suit was. I didn't answer. I simply told him that, for his entire life, his parents had made every choice on his behalf. They had determined what he believed, who he trusted, and what kind of world he inhabited. But tomorrow night, the choice was entirely his own. I told my grandson he had to pick a side. He could pocket the drive, walk away, and throw his lot in with people who had built everything on deception and theft. Or he could hand it over and stand with the truth. I lifted my black tea, took a final sip, and rose from the booth. I looked down at the young man wrestling with the hardest decision of his life. Caden reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers closing tight around the cold metal of the drive. He looked up and gave one single definitive nod. The battle lines were drawn. The grand ballroom of the downtown luxury hotel was a cathedral of glittering crystal and relentless camera flashes. It was the night of my foundation's annual charity gala, the undisputed peak of the city's corporate and social calendar. Down below on the sweeping red carpet that fed into the main hall, a full circus of media and high society was already in motion. The photographers' flashes popped like small bursts of lightning, lighting up the absolute height of my son's arrogance. Derek and Vanessa were planted squarely in the center of the media swarm, soaking up a spotlight they had done nothing to deserve. They carried themselves like royalty draped in the kind of staggering luxury that can only be purchased with stolen money. Derek wore a bespoke charcoal tuxedo that fit him flawlessly. Vanessa stood beside him in a breathtaking floor-length sapphire gown, her neck and wrists dripping with diamonds. I knew precisely what those outfits had cost, because the fraud alerts from my corporate credit accounts had been lighting up my phone all afternoon. They had held nothing back, treating my name and my credit line as their own bottomless account. They were parading through the spoils of their anticipated victory, completely blind to the fact that every diamond and every thread of silk was simply another nail in their legal coffin. I stood alone on the curved second-floor mezzanine balcony, tucked in the soft shadows, watching the spectacle below. The acoustics of the grand hall carried their voices up to me with perfect clarity. A local financial reporter thrust a microphone toward Derek, asking about his sudden appearance in the city and his connection to my medical technology empire. Derek produced a practiced, effortlessly charming smile. He pulled Vanessa close with an arm around her waist, presenting the polished image of a devoted family man. He leaned into the microphone, his voice layered with a carefully manufactured humility. "My father is a brilliant man," Derek said smoothly, addressing the crowd of reporters. "He has constructed something truly extraordinary here, but he is getting older, and the weight of leading a global company is beginning to show. I am here to step up. I am here to take over the empire so that he can finally rest. It is my duty as his son to carry this torch and see that he is cared for in his final years. He has given so much to this world. Now it is time for his family to give back to him." Vanessa nodded at his side, pressing a manicured hand over her heart, performing the role of the devoted, loving daughter-in-law with absolute conviction. I tightened my grip on the cold marble railing of the balcony. The sheer, undiluted poison of his words was almost something to admire. He stood there drinking in the adoration of the press, casting himself as the faithful heir rushing to his aging father's side. This was the same man who had left me with $150 and a note to figure it out. This was the man currently being tracked by federal investigators for embezzling $4 million from his own investors. He was delivering the performance of his life, stacking his pedestal higher and higher, swelling his ego until it filled the entire room. That was exactly what I needed. I wanted him to feel the full, intoxicating rush of absolute power. Then, a sharp-eyed journalist from a major business publication glanced up and caught sight of me, standing on the mezzanine. A ripple moved through the crowd as dozens of heads tilted upward. The camera flashes redirected, washing my face in light from the shadows. Derek followed their gaze and looked up at me. That charming smile of his slipped for just a fraction of a moment, a brief flash of nervous anticipation in his eyes before he caught himself and turned a beaming manufactured grin up toward me. Mr. Gerald, the journalist, called out, his voice carrying through the soaring hall. Your son just addressed the room about the company's future. Will tonight mark your exit? Are you formally stepping aside and anointing him your successor? Every sound in the ballroom died at once. Hundreds of pairs of eyes among them, the hungry, desperate stares of my son and his wife, fixed themselves entirely on me. They were waiting for the validation they were certain they had cleverly engineered. They were waiting for me to stand before the world and surrender my life's work into their grasping hands. I rested my palms on the railing and looked straight down at Derek. I let the silence do its work, allowing his anticipation to coil tighter and tighter. I offered a slow, unhurried smile that revealed absolutely nothing. Tonight is a very special night. I projected my voice, carrying cleanly to every reporter, every investor, every guest packed into that room. It is a night about legacy, about truth, and about the future. I have reached my decision regarding the fate of this company and my fortune, and I give you my word, tonight everything will pass to the one who has truly earned it. The press erupted into a frenzy of whispered speculation, pens scratching and cameras clicking in rapid bursts. Down in the crowd, Derek's eyes blazed with euphoric, blinding triumph. Vanessa released a long, visible breath of relief, her rehearsed smile spreading wide across her face. They had taken my words and run them through the filter of their own towering narcissism. They were absolutely certain they had claimed the ultimate prize. Not one of them understood that the curtain was seconds from rising on their complete undoing. The heavy velvet curtains swept apart, and I walked out onto the main stage of the downtown luxury hotel grand ballroom. The full force of the theatrical spotlight struck me the instant I stepped forward, washing the sea of faces in the vast room into a brilliant, blinding glare that pooled around the podium. As I moved toward center stage, the low-layered hum of hundreds of overlapping voices began to dissolve. The ringing of crystal champagne flutes and the soft scuff of expensive shoes faded away entirely until a heavy, expectant hush settled over the whole hall. This was the moment the city's elite had spent the entire evening waiting for. I adjusted the microphone, the metallic scrape cutting sharply across the room. I looked out into the audience. The harsh stage lighting turned the guests in the back rows to little more than dark silhouettes. But the front row was lit up perfectly. Standing dead center, practically pressing their knees against the velvet rope that divided the stage from the crowd, were Derek and Vanessa. They were nearly trembling with anticipation. Derek had undone his suit jacket and leaned his weight forward like a sprinter coiled at the starting line. He stared up at me with wide, unblinking eyes, a tight, arrogant smile locked across his face. His hand had already drifted to his chest, fingers working absently at his designer silk tie, his body already rehearsing the first step up to accept his coronation. Vanessa stood shoulder to shoulder with him, her manicured hands laced tightly together in front of her floor-length sapphire gown, gazing up at me with a manufactured expression of breathless devotion. They were so completely swallowed by their own staggering greed that neither of them caught the cold, hollow, utterly unyielding look in my eyes. I leaned into the microphone, my voice ringing out deep and measured, commanding every person in that room to listen. 15 years ago, I said, letting the words hang suspended in the air. 15 years ago, I stood on an empty driveway with nothing but the clothes on my back. I had no home, I had no family, I had exactly $150 to my name. A soft, captivated murmur moved through the crowd of investors and journalists. They loved this story. To them it was the purest American underdog narrative, the visionary founder who had clawed his way up from the wreckage of personal ruin to build a medical technology empire. Down in the front row, Derek's smile widened. He nodded along in slow, measured strokes, playing the devoted son, convinced this was simply the dramatic prologue to his grand introduction. I built this company on a foundation of pure survival. I continued keeping my gaze trained directly on Derek. I spent the last 15 years securing the future, developing innovations that transform lives, and building a legacy of extraordinary wealth. But true legacy is not merely about what you construct. It is about what you leave behind, and more importantly, who you leave it to. The tension in the ballroom wound itself to a breaking point. Camera flashes intensified into a rapid strobing barrage, capturing the historic moment from every angle. Derek took a half step forward, his polished leather shoes nudging the velvet rope. He was ready. He was waiting for his name. Tonight, I announced, I am declaring the final irrevocable disposition of my entire estate. My voice dropped to a sharp, lethal register. Effective immediately, 100% of my corporate equity, my voting rights, my real estate holdings, and my personal liquid assets are being permanently transferred into a newly established ironclad legal entity. Derek's chest swelled. He glanced sideways at the journalists, already bracing to absorb their envy. I am officially launching the $150 trust, I declared. Derek blinked. That arrogant smile froze where it was. A genuine, unguarded confusion moved across his eyes. Vanessa's clasped hands dropped slowly to her sides. That this foundation. I continued projecting over the sudden ripple of bewildered murmuring from the crowd, is dedicated exclusively to the protection and rehabilitation of elderly individuals who have suffered severe financial abuse. It will wage absolute legal and financial warfare against those who prey upon the vulnerable. Specifically, it is built to hunt down and prosecute family members, the sons and daughters who manipulate, discard, and rob the very parents who gave them life. The ballroom dropped into a suffocating total silence. Reporters stopped raising their cameras. The wealthy elite stared up at the stage in pure, stunned shock. I looked down at the front row. Every drop of color had drained from Derek's face. He looked like a man who had just been thrown from an aircraft without a parachute. His mouth hung slightly open, his breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. Vanessa looked as though she might be physically ill. Let me be perfectly clear so there is no confusion whatsoever about the future of my empire, I said, driving the final nail with surgical precision. My wealth belongs to the forgotten. It belongs to the betrayed. It will build a fortress for those left out in the cold. There are no corporate heirs. There will be no transfer of generational wealth. Not a single cent of my fortune will ever reach my bloodline. The shockwave that tore through the ballroom was instantaneous. A collective audible gasp rose from the crowd. Down in the front row, the carefully polished facade of the loving son cracked apart completely and violently. The full weight of what had just happened crashed into Derek, shattering him. The billions he had already spent in his mind evaporated into nothing. The public humiliation broke him wide open. He lunged toward the stage, seizing the velvet rope with both hands, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. He did not care about the cameras. He did not care about the hundreds of powerful people watching every move he made. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice shrieking off the grand walls. He yelled that I was losing my mind. He screamed that I was a senile, crazy old man who didn't know what he was doing. His face darkened to a furious purple as he jabbed a shaking finger up at me, screaming that I had absolutely no right to stand on that stage and strip away his assets. Derek kept screaming, face flushed a deep, violent red, demanding that someone intervene, that someone stop me. I did not raise my voice. I did not signal security to pull him away. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and produced a small black remote. I pointed it toward the control booth at the back of the room and pressed a single button. The massive screen behind me flickered. The corporate logo of my medical technology firm disappeared completely. In its place, a new image filled the grand ballroom, a high-definition photograph, 30 feet tall. It showed no pharmaceutical breakthrough. It showed no blueprint for a new senior care facility. It showed a piece of yellowed, torn paper lying beside a crumpled $100 bill and a single $50 bill. The handwriting on that note had been enlarged to a scale perfectly legible to every person in the room. It read simply, "You will figure it out." I leaned back into the microphone, my voice perfectly calm and lethal. I told the audience to look closely at the screen. I explained that what they were seeing was the entire foundation on which my billionaire empire had been built. I told them this was the generous inheritance my only son had left me 15 years ago. A wave of confused muttering moved through the crowd. I did not leave them wondering for long. I told the packed ballroom exactly what had happened during the week I buried my wife. I described the suffocating fog of grief that had left me completely paralyzed. I explained how Derek, the man standing in the front row performing the role of devoted son, had come to me, while I was heavily medicated and hollowed out by sorrow. He placed a stack of papers in my hands, telling me they were routine hospital bills and life insurance documents that required my signature. I trusted my son. I signed every page without reading a single word. I told the crowd how, a few days later, I returned from a walk to find the locks on my own front door had been changed. The house had been quietly sold out from under me. My son and his wife had packed their things, emptied our joint bank accounts, and crossed state lines. They left me on that porch with nothing but the clothes on my back, that pitiful fold of cash, and a cold handwritten note. The silence inside the downtown luxury hotel grand ballroom shattered. A thunderous unified roar of shock and revulsion erupted from the hundreds of investors, philanthropists, and journalists in that room. The reporters crowding the edge of the stage understood in an instant that they had stumbled into the biggest corporate scandal of the decade. They swung their heavy cameras away from the podium and aimed them straight down at the front row. A relentless, blinding volley of camera flashes struck Derek full in the face. He lurched backward, throwing both hands up to shield his eyes. That arrogant, carefully constructed posture of his collapsed entirely. He looked like a cornered animal, shaking his head, muttering under his breath, searching for somewhere to go. The wealthy elites and powerful industry figures who had been shaking his hand and raising their glasses to his future only minutes before now stepped away from him. They pulled back, leaving a wide, vacant ring around Derek and his wife, treating them like something contagious. Derek tried to speak, tried to mount some defense, but the crowd swallowed his voice whole. The public humiliation was complete and crushing. The glorious coronation he had been savoring all evening had become a brutal televised execution. Every fabricated thing he had told the media earlier that night was now closing around his throat. Vanessa watched their entire world turn to ash in a matter of seconds. The realization that not a single cent of that billion-dollar fortune was coming to them hit her, followed immediately by the cold terror of public destruction. The carefully maintained image of the loving daughter-in-law dissolved on the spot. Raw, unhinged panic seized her completely. She lunged forward with a sudden violent burst of energy. She tore a heavy microphone right out of the hands of a stunned financial reporter standing near the velvet rope. She gripped it with both fists, knuckles draining white, and screamed into the device. Her voice shrieked out over the grand speakers and ricocheted off the high ceilings. She called me a liar. She stabbed a frantic finger toward the stage, her breathing ragged and wild. She screamed to the crowd that they were listening to a crazy, senile old man who was inventing stories for attention. She scrambled desperately to spin a new version of events, shouting that I was the one who had abandoned them. She claimed I had drained the family accounts and disappeared with a mistress, leaving her and Derek to scrape by in poverty. She begged the journalists to put down their cameras, pleaded with the investors to disbelieve every word I had spoken. She was completely unraveling, spiraling into a tangle of pathetic, fabricated lies. She opened her mouth to hurl another accusation, to cast herself as the ultimate victim, but before another sound could leave her lips, a different voice cut cleanly through the chaos. It was young, shaking with raw emotion, and amplified by the ballroom's sound system. The camera flashes stopped dead. Every head in that grand hall, including Vanessa's and Derek's, swung away from the stage and turned toward the heavy service doors at the back of the room. The shrill, frantic echo of Vanessa screaming her fabricated lies into the microphone was cut short. The heavy wooden service doors at the far end of the grand ballroom burst open with a boom that reverberated straight through the floorboards. Every camera flash died. Hundreds of powerful investors and aggressive journalists turned as one. Walking down the long center aisle, perfectly lit by the crystal chandeliers overhead, was Caden. My 22-year-old grandson did not look like the frightened college student who had sat across from me in that small corner diner just 24 hours earlier. His shoulders were squared back. His jaw was set hard. He moved with a heavy, deliberate stride, heading straight toward the brightly lit stage. Vanessa froze. She stood near the velvet rope, still clutching the stolen microphone, her face pale and slick with nervous sweat. She stared at her son as though she were looking at a ghost. Derek, still reeling from the devastating blow of his public exposure, turned and locked eyes with Caden. Derek demanded to know what he was doing there. He ordered Caden to leave the room, to go back to the hotel, and stay out of matters that didn't concern him. He was reaching for whatever shred of parental authority he still had, trying to claw back some fragment of his crumbling empire. but his words landed on completely deaf ears. Caden did not slow down. He did not look at his father. His eyes were fixed entirely on his mother. Caden reached the edge of the stage. He stepped directly over the velvet rope, paying no attention to the security guards who were too stunned by the unfolding scene to move. He walked straight up to Vanessa. She tried to arrange her face into a shaky motherly smile. She extended a trembling hand and told him to tell these people that the old man was lying. She begged him to back up her version of events to tell the press how much they had all suffered. Caden looked down at her. He reached out and took the microphone right out of her sweating hands. He raised it to his mouth, and his voice rolled across the vast, silent ballroom. He looked his mother dead in the eye and told her to shut her mouth. A collective gasp tore through the elite audience. Reporters scrambled to bring their cameras back up, capturing every agonizing second of this family's destruction. Vanessa stumbled backward as if she had taken a physical blow. Caden turned his back on his mother and faced the sea of journalists. He did not hesitate. He told the absolute unvarnished truth. He announced his name into the microphone and declared that everything I had just said was completely true. He told that silent, packed room that his entire life his parents had fed him, a sickening, poisonous lie that his grandfather was a coward who had drained the accounts and run. Caden paused, his voice trembling with raw emotion, but he did not falter. He pointed a finger directly at Derek. He told the crowd his father was a thief and a fraud. He revealed that just the day before, he had learned the truth for the first time. He told them how his parents had left his grandfather homeless with exactly $150 to his name. He explained how they had fled the state and constructed their fraudulent luxury life on the back of an old man deep in grief. Caden looked at the investors in the front row and told them his parents had not come to this gala to honor any legacy. They had come to steal what remained of it because their own real estate operation was completely bankrupt. They had come to use a 72-year-old man as a human shield against their own catastrophic crimes. The ballroom erupted into total, absolute chaos. Journalists shouted questions over each other, their voices merging into a deafening roar. Investors yanked out their phones, frantically calling their financial advisors to pull any backing they had tied to Derek. The public execution was complete and flawless. Vanessa buried her face in her hands, sobbing hysterically as the twin realities of prison and poverty crashed down on her. But Derek did not cry. The last remaining thread of his sanity snapped clean. The son he had manipulated, the boy he had controlled his entire life, had just driven a knife through his public image in front of the most powerful people in the city. Pure, unadulterated rage blinded Derek. He let out a feral, completely unhinged scream that cut straight through the noise of the crowd. He lowered his head and charged the stage like a rabid animal. He vaulted over the velvet rope, eyes locked entirely on Caden. He drew back his fist, preparing to deliver a violent, devastating blow to his own son just to make him stop. He wanted to punish the boy for tearing his empire down. He wanted to silence the truth by force, but he had completely forgotten who else was standing on that stage. What I'm about to share with that ballroom and with you is the moment this whole story turns on its axis. Everything I built, everything I endured, is about to be placed in plain sight for the world to judge. Before I get there, tell me this. If someone you loved had been quietly working against you for years, would you confront them the moment you found out? Or would you wait, gather every last piece of proof, and choose your moment? Security could wait. I had no intention of flinching. 40-odd years of hard living had turned my reflexes into something closer to stone than flesh. The moment Derek went for Caden, I put myself squarely between them, weight low, both palms driving hard into the middle of his chest. All that charging fury met something he hadn't counted on a man with nothing left standing to lose. Derek's feet went out from under him. He reeled backward, arms cutting wild circles through the air. The Grand Hotel's security team didn't give him a second to recover. 6 broad-shouldered guards in dark suits hit the stage from every angle at once. They brought Derek down hard, seizing both arms, and drove him face first into the hardwood. The crack of his body hitting the stage traveled straight through the microphone Caden had left lying there. Derek bucked and cursed, grinding his mouth against the floorboards, while the guards wrenched his wrists behind him and held them there. The smooth, commanding executive the world thought it knew had ceased to exist. What the cameras were sending to millions of viewers right then was something far uglier, a snarling, pinned man being broken in public. The evening, though, still had one final card to play. The final crushing blow was still waiting in the wings. The camera flashes strobed like lightning as the packed crowd split open again, instinctively making room for what was coming. That thud of Derek hitting the polished hardwood floor had barely faded before the silence in the ballroom turned total. 6 guards held my son utterly flat. His arms were torqued back at a punishing angle, his costly bespoke charcoal tuxedo bunching and splitting under the bodies pressing down on him. He was writhing the way a snared animal does, face mashed into the stage, pulling ragged gulps of air. Nobody in the audience moved. Every billionaire, every investor, every journalist in that room stood frozen gaping at the implosion of a man who had considered himself untouchable. Then the backstage darkness shifted and someone walked out of it. Clifton, my chief legal counsel. He didn't move with any urgency. His stride was measured and deliberate, a man who had rehearsed this moment in his mind many times and knew it belonged entirely to him. Not a flicker of feeling crossed his face. Tucked under his arm was a thick manila folder. The stage lighting fell across the front cover and lit up the bold red lettering stamped there for everyone to read. Clifton stepped around the fallen microphone and came to a stop directly above Derek. Derek strained his neck, twisting upward to look face-flushed, and running with sweat, something like raw fear beginning to pool behind his eyes. His gaze moved from Clifton to the folder and back again. He could feel what was inside it, even before it had opened. Clifton gave him nothing. He just opened his fingers and let the folder fall. It hit the floor with a flat, deliberate slap beside my son's sweat-damp face. Pages fanned out across the hardwood, spreading themselves under the stage lights as if they had been arranged that way on purpose. Every journalist in the front row surged forward, their lenses zeroed in without hesitation on the unmistakable federal seal crowning the forensic accounting report. Clifton crouched and picked up the microphone Caden had dropped. One tap against his palm to confirm it was live. The tap rang out through the entire hall. Then he looked down at Derek and delivered his words with the kind of cold precision that leaves no room for misunderstanding. He laid it out plainly. Derek had come into my private boardroom 24 hours ago, making aggressive demands for a $2 million loan to keep his collapsing real estate business alive. Every syllable landed clean and level over the speakers. He then told the room something else. The story about a rough patch in the market, a short-term downturn, nothing serious was invented. He gestured at the documents fanned out across the floor and stated that the forensic audit inside of that folder established without any shadow of doubt that Derek had stolen $4 million from his own investors. The sound that came out of that audience wasn't a gasp so much as a collective physical jolt. People who had been greeting Derek warmly an hour before stumbled backward as if shoved. A handful yanked out their phones on the spot, barking orders at their finance people to cut every thread connecting them to his operation. Cameras strobed across the scattered bank statements as journalists shot frame after frame the shell companies right there in black and white, the falsified vendor invoices plain as anything. What had been a private crime was now a public exhibit broadcast in real time. Derek went still against the guards. Whatever energy had been fueling his resistance drained away at once, swapped out for something icier and far heavier. He couldn't stop his eyes from moving across the documents splayed near his face. The flagged wire transfers, the precise dates the money had moved, all that fury, the hot righteous anger he'd used to justify going after his own child burned down to nothing. He was no longer a man owed anything. He was a man with no exits left. In the front row, Vanessa crumpled to her knees, both hands clutched at her floor-length sapphire gown as the full weight of what had just happened crashed down on her. The life she'd constructed on someone else's stolen money was finished. The mansion, the fleet of cars, the fantasy of a billionaire legacy, none of it existed anymore. What remained was a poverty she couldn't outrun, and a federal prison sentence already forming on the horizon. That was when a different sound entered the room. It threaded in quietly at first, a distant keen rising off the city streets, but it got sharper and closer with each breath. Police sirens, and not just one. Patrol cars and federal vehicles were funneling toward the hotel from multiple directions. The noise worked its way through the ballroom's walls and glass burrowing into my son's skull. Something primal and ugly took hold of him. He erupted under the guard's shoulders, twisting legs, kicking in a frantic search for any gap, any opening. He shouted that it was all manufactured, that someone had faked the paperwork, but the words came out strangled his voice, betraying the terror he was trying to hide. He threw himself against the hands bearing down on him, head snapping toward the back of the room, hunting for a door that had already been sealed against him. The sirens climbed until they shook the crystal overhead. Then the ballroom's main doors swung inward, the heavy brass handles turning in unison, the wide panels spreading apart. Every murmur in that crowd of elites cut off at once, the room dropping into a silence so dense you could feel it pressing on your ears. Uniformed officers poured into the hall and spread to every corner, but the officers weren't in front. Ahead of them came four men in dark gray suits, crisp and perfectly fitted. They walked in exact step with one another, no hesitation, no expression, nothing wasted. Attached to their belts and hanging on lanyards at their chests were the gold shields of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I knew those men the moment I saw them. They were precisely who I had quietly indicated to Caden earlier in the night. The ones who had been positioned near the service doors. The ones now carrying the flash drive that held every document needed to put my son in a federal penitentiary for what remained of his life. The crowd divided ahead of them, automatically billionaires and philanthropists and journalists pressing back, making a corridor without being asked. The agents registered none of it. No glance for the cameras, not a single acknowledgement of the glittering room around them. Their focus was fixed on one point, the stage, and the man still face down on the floor. Derek wrenched his head sideways, scraping his cheek along the polished wood, trying to get a look at who was cutting through the crowd. The moment those gold badges caught the stage light, something in him simply quit. His whole body went slack, and a low, broken sound came out of him that had nothing to do with anger. He found Caden with his eyes standing at the far edge of the stage, and in that instant, the full shape of it landed on him. He knew now who Caden had placed that flash drive with. What he felt as betrayal had taken 15 years to arrive. It didn't come close to what he had done to me. The lead agent mounted the stage, his shoes pressing down over the forensic accounting papers Clifton had scattered there moments before. He gave a short signal to the hotel guards. They released their grip and pulled Derek up onto his knees. The agent stood over my son, unclipping a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. He read the charges in a voice that filled the room, top to bottom, wall to wall. Wire fraud, embezzlement, grand larceny, conspiracy to defraud investors of $4 million. Each count hit like a separate demolition, bringing down another section of the empire Derek had spent years constructing. While the agent continued reading Derek his rights, something below caught my eye, a sudden frantic motion pulling my attention downward. Vanessa had been kneeling in the front row, locked in place by the sheer scale of what was unfolding around her. But the moment a federal prison sentence stopped being abstract and became something she could see forming right in front of her face, the paralysis shattered into something wild and unhinged. The stolen corporate cards, the designer wardrobes, the luxury vehicles she understood, in an instant they were all gone. Her freedom was expiring by the second. She lurched forward, her expensive floor-length sapphire gown snagging and tearing on the leg of a stray camera tripod. She crawled to the lip of the stage mascara, cutting black tracks down her face. Every trace of composure had abandoned her. She reached past the velvet rope and wrapped both hands around my pant leg, gripping hard. Her fingers were shaking, her diamond rings flashing under the harsh lights as she dug into the fabric of my suit. "Dad," she choked out, voice climbing toward a hysterical pitch. "Dad, please, you have to stop them. You have to tell them it is a misunderstanding. We can fix this. We can give the money back. Please do not let them take us away. We are family. You have to save us. We are your family." She tilted her face up at me, eyes red and swollen, desperate, expecting the soft, forgiving old grandfather to step forward and absorb the punishment she had brought entirely on herself. She genuinely believed the word family still carried some currency between us. I looked down at the woman who had helped engineer my destruction. I looked at the same hands that had cheerfully boxed up my belongings while I was grieving the death of my wife. There was no anger in me at that moment, no pity either. Only the cold, clear light of justice, clean and undisturbed. I did not crouch to console her. Not a single reassuring word left my lips. I held her gaze and with one slow, deliberate motion, drew my leg back until her shaking hands slid off the fabric entirely. She pitched forward, slightly, palms slapping the stage floor. I looked down at that weeping, ruined face. I leaned in just far enough that my voice would carry to her and Derek alone, quiet enough to be private, sharp enough to cut bone. I looked at the two people who had stripped away my past, and I handed them their future in 4 words. "You will figure it out," I said. The precise phrase they had left on that yellowed note 15 years ago. The exact words they had used to cast me out onto the street. Hearing them spoken back at her shattered whatever Vanessa had left. She folded against the velvet rope face buried in her hands, wailing with a despair she had no way out. While the federal agents hauled her husband upright and snapped the steel cuffs tight around his wrists. That small metallic click, the handcuffs locking, rang out above the dying wail of the sirens outside. That one tiny sound seemed to sever the last thread holding Derek together. He did not bow his head. He did not go quietly. Instead, something savage and cornered seized full control of him. He wrenched his torso hard against the agents, gripping his arms, and turned his bloodshot eyes on his wife. Vanessa was still slumped against the velvet rope, her floor-length sapphire gown, shredded mascara streaking down her face in dark rivers. Derek looked at the woman he had partnered with to dismantle my life, and without a moment's hesitation, he threw her to the wolves. He shouted at the federal agents, his voice cracking apart with fear. He told them to take her too. He yelled that he wasn't the one who had planned it, that Vanessa had orchestrated the entire conspiracy from the beginning. He jerked his cuffed wrist toward her and screamed that she was the one who pressured him into selling my house 15 years ago. He told the stunned investors and journalists that Vanessa had personally forged the legal documents and manipulated the power of attorney while I was heavily medicated and buried in grief over my wife's death. The naked, spectacular betrayal in his voice was something to witness. He was prepared to hand over the mother of his child without flinching if it bought him even one less month behind bars. Those accusations hit Vanessa like cold water. The tears stopped. Every ounce of despair curdled instantly into venom. The composed society wife evaporated, completely replaced by something feral and cornered. She hauled herself up off the floor, ignoring the ruin of her dress, and threw herself at her husband. A hotel security guard had to move fast, locking both arms around her shoulders to keep her from reaching Derek's face. She screamed right back at him, voice stripped of everything except raw fury. She told the federal agents to disregard every word out of his mouth. She called Derek a pathological liar, a coward, a degenerate. She pitched her voice over the roiling chaos of the ballroom, announcing to every journalist and investor present that Derek had personally driven his real estate firm into the ground through his own catastrophic incompetence. She screamed that he was the one who had directly embezzled the $4 million from the private investors. She told the entire room he hadn't lost the money in a bad market at all. He had burned every last cent of it on illegal offshore gambling and a mountain of hidden debts. She confessed to the crowd, without anyone even asking, that she had only participated in the credit card fraud because Derek had bankrupted the family and threatened to leave her with nothing. The carefully maintained portrait of a successful, happy marriage detonated publicly in front of hundreds of camera lenses. It was mutual annihilation, plain and absolute. The two of them stood in the full blaze of the stage lights, tearing each other open, voluntarily spilling federal confessions, just to make certain the other one went down too. Two drowning rats each trying to climb over the other's head for one last gasp of air. The federal agents barely needed to ask a question. They stepped back and let the pair scream their admissions into the open room while the journalists captured every damning word. The microphones caught it all, broadcasting their confessions to everyone watching. Then the lead agent gave a single sharp nod. Two officers stepped forward, took Vanessa by the arms, wrenched her hands behind her back, and locked a second pair of steel handcuffs onto her wrists. She kicked and scraped her heels across the polished floor, still hurling profanities at her husband. Derek kept shouting over her voice, cracking, begging anyone who'd listen for a plea deal, promising testimony against his wife, as they physically dragged him down the long center aisle of the grand ballroom. The assembled guests stepped aside without a word. Every billionaire, every industry figure, every member of the press watched in stunned, appalled silence as the two people who had swept into that room, looking like corporate royalty, were hauled away like rabid animals. The massive ballroom doors swung shut behind them, with a heavy final thud cutting off their screaming as though a switch had been thrown. The camera flashes dimmed and went dark. The frantic, suffocating energy of the room drained away, leaving something vast and still in its place. I stood motionless at the center of the stage and looked out over the silent crowd. I found Clifton below me, my lawyer, and he gave me a slow nod full of quiet respect. I looked over at Caden, my grandson who stood staring at those closed wooden doors, processing in silence the permanent end of the life he had known. The grand hall held nothing but quiet now. The storm had finally blown itself out. The war I had waged without a single public word was finished. My empire was intact, the order of my life restored without a crack in it. What had been a deafening ballroom, flashing cameras, shouting reporters, agents marching my son out in handcuffs, had emptied into nothing, gone. In its place, the glittering wreckage of a broken empire, shattered champagne flutes, discarded cocktail napkins, the torn, trampled pages of the forensic accounting report scattered across the expensive hardwood like fallen leaves. The elite guests had cleared out fast their luxury town cars, carrying them well away from the toxic collapse of my family's very public undoing. I stood near the edge of the stage as the heavy silence settled across my shoulders and let my eyes move through the vast empty hall. There, half hidden in the shadows beneath the grand sweeping staircase, was Caden. My 22-year-old grandson had come apart completely. He was sitting on the lowest marble step, elbows propped on his knees, face pressed deep into both hands. His shoulders shook with silent, convulsive sobs. He had just watched federal agents drag his mother and father out of that building to face decades behind bars. He had stood before the entire world and permanently dismantled the only family he had ever belonged to. I understood exactly what was bearing down on him in that moment. It wasn't simply the trauma of the betrayal. It was the suffocating, vertigo-inducing weight of his brand new reality. An hour ago, he was the privileged heir to a sprawling real estate fortune, a young man who had never once lost sleep over a credit card statement or a tuition bill. Now he was the son of 2 convicted felons. His name was permanently blackened by a massive federal fraud scandal that had detonated on live television. The imaginary trust fund his parents had dangled in front of him, his whole life, was gone without a trace, replaced by a crushing pile of student loan debt that now belonged entirely to him. He had nothing, and he was alone. A younger, softer version of myself might have crossed that floor and wrapped my arms around him. I might have told him it would all work out, that I would handle it, that a large enough check could absorb the pain. But I had learned through hard experience that shielding a young man from the true weight of consequences doesn't protect him. It corrupts him. That brand of blind, unconditional financial cushioning was precisely what had warped his father into the man those agents had just hauled away. I was not going to repeat that error. A few yards off, a hotel janitor had edged out of the service corridor, wide push broom in hand, glancing around uncertainly, unsure whether the floor was his to reclaim yet. I walked over, reached out and took the broom from him without a word. Then I turned and moved deliberately across the debris-strewn floor, the soles of my shoes clicking against the hardwood, until I was standing directly in front of my grandson. Caden didn't look up. He stayed folded into his grief, entirely consumed by it. I did not crouch to meet him. I offered no gentle word. I simply held the broom out and let it drop. The wooden handle cracked loudly against the marble steps, landing inches from his shoes. Caden flinched and pulled his hands away from his tear-streaked face. He looked at the broom, then slowly raised his eyes to mine, red swollen, thoroughly bewildered. "You did a very brave thing tonight, Caden," I said, my voice level, and carrying the kind of authority that doesn't invite negotiation. "You stood up in front of the world and chose the truth over a comfortable, profitable lie. I respect you for that. But crying on the floor of a luxury hotel is not going to pay off your student loans. It is not going to put food on your table, and it is certainly not going to rebuild your ruined reputation." Caden stared at me, breath snagging in his throat. He was waiting to be rescued. He expected his billionaire grandfather to produce a checkbook and erase the terrifying uncertainty swallowing his future. I held his gaze and dismantled that expectation on the spot. "The illusion of your wealth died tonight," I told him, letting my eyes sweep across the empty, ravaged ballroom around us. "Your parents spent their entire lives trying to steal their way upward because honest effort genuinely frightened them. They taught you how to wear an expensive suit. They taught you how to carry yourself like you were above everyone else in the room. But they never once taught you how to actually survive. That lesson begins now. Pick up the broom, Caden. Start cleaning up this mess. Honest labor will clear your head." The silence between us went heavy and absolute. I watched the internal battle work its way across his young, tear-blotched face. He looked at the broom, then out at the vast, daunting wreckage spread across the ballroom floor. For one long, gut-tightening second, I thought he was going to refuse. I thought the toxic entitlement his parents had spent years cementing into him was going to outlast his desire to become something different. But then Caden reached up and dragged his sleeve across his face. He pulled in a long, shuddering breath, leaned forward, and closed both hands around the rough wooden handle. He rose to his feet, stepped forward through the debris, and took his very first step forward. It was the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do, and it was the first real lesson in unforgiving independence that his parents had never once bothered to give him. The morning air outside was crisp, carrying pine and damp earth on it. A taxi rolled to the curb, and Caden climbed out looking hollowed by exhaustion, but surprisingly clear-headed. He had spent the entire night sweeping the wreckage from the grand ballroom floor. That grinding physical labor had scraped away the last residue of his entitled upbringing. He walked up the short gravel driveway and stopped taking in the surroundings with quiet disbelief. He was standing in front of my actual home, not a sprawling estate, not a towering glass penthouse, a sturdy, unpretentious wooden house settled into a quiet, unassuming suburb. The lawn was neatly kept. The front porch was modest, and the paint ran a muted shade of gray. This was the life I had built for myself, well away from the blinding glare and toxic appetites of the corporate world. I was on the wooden porch swing, holding a mug of black tea, watching my grandson come up the walk. Caden climbed the 3 wooden steps and stood before me. He bore no resemblance to the polished air his parents had worked so hard to manufacture. He looked like a young man surfacing slowly and painfully from a very long and very dark nightmare. He kept his eyes fixed on the wooden floorboards for a long moment before looking up to meet mine. His voice carried the full weight of shame when he finally spoke. He told me he was deeply sorry for everything his parents had done. He apologized for living comfortably on money that had been stolen from me and for never once questioning the lies that had been fed to him his entire life. I took a slow sip of tea and nodded. An apology is a good start, I told him, but words don't cost anything. True character reveals itself in what a man does after he says he's sorry. Caden swallowed, shifting his weight. He told me his entire life had been turned inside out. With his parents facing federal prison and every asset they held frozen by the government, he was left with nothing at all. His university tuition was badly past due, and he was carrying a pile of debt his father had secretly taken out in his name. His voice trembled as he asked the question I had known was coming. He wanted a loan, just something modest. He said enough to cover his most urgent debts and keep him from being thrown out of his campus apartment. He promised to repay every single penny once he had his degree and found steady work. I didn't hesitate. I set my mug down on the small wooden table beside the swing, looked him squarely in the eye, and told him absolutely not. I would not give him a single cent in cash. Caden flinched as though I had struck him. He started to say something to argue or plead, and I raised one hand to cut him off before the words could form. Handing over raw cash, I told him, was the identical mistake I had made with his father. Blind financial coddling was a deadly poison. It had produced a lazy, entitled man who believed the world owed him everything he desired. I told Caden I loved him far too much to pass that same disease on to him. I was not going to write a check and strip him of the chance to learn how to stand on his own 2 feet. I reached down beside the swing and lifted a plain manila folder from the floor. I held it out to him. Caden took it with unsteady hands and opened it. Inside was a legally binding contract I had drawn up with Clifton early that morning. I walked him through the terms without softening a word. My foundation would pay his university tuition directly to the school administration. Not a single dollar of it would pass through his hands. In exchange for that support, he was required to work 25 hours a week as a clerk at the $150 trust. His job would be processing intake forms, manning the phones, and spending his days in direct service to the very elderly victims his parents had looked down on with such contempt. I made it clear, a standard hourly rate, nothing more, and every dollar of it would go toward covering his rent, putting food on his table, and clearing whatever debts he carried. No high-end vehicles, no tailored wardrobe, no one footing the bill but himself. Caden went through the document line by line. I kept my eyes on his face, watching for that particular brand of poisonous arrogance his mother had spent years cultivating in him. I braced for the moment he would shove the folder aside and storm off, insulted, indignant, too good for honest work. It never came. Instead, something remarkable happened. The tension drained out of him all at once, replaced by a deep, settling calm that spread across his exhausted face. Money had been the weapon his parents aimed at him his whole life, a tool for purchasing his silence, rewarding his compliance, keeping him locked inside their carefully constructed illusion. What I was offering him was the opposite of all that. It was structure. It was truth. It was a doorway to something he had never once been given the chance to build himself from the ground up. He straightened his shoulders and met my eyes, and in his gaze there was something quiet and resolute, something new. He asked for a pen. I fished the gold-tipped pen from my breast pocket and placed it in his hand. He pressed the folder flat against the wooden porch railing and put his signature to the page. No pause, no second thoughts. That signature drew the boundary. It laid the first real brick. 6 months then came and went fast, relentless, with the kind of momentum that doesn't ask permission. The thick oak doors of the federal courthouse sealed closed behind us, cutting off the frenzy of reporters jostling on the marble steps outside. Every seat inside was taken. Journalists packed the gallery alongside former investors and spectators, hungry to see the concluding act of the most spectacular family implosion the city had ever produced. I occupied the polished wooden chair at the witness stand, fingers composed in my lap, making one small adjustment to my cuff. On the far side of the aisle, Derek and Vanessa sat at the bare metal defense table. Gone was any trace of the commanding power couple who had swept down that red carpet 6 months prior. The bespoke suits, the sapphire gowns, all of it had been swapped for shapeless, muted prison-issue jumpsuits. Derek was a shell. The man who had once filled every room with his presence now seemed to be shrinking out of existence. The color had left his face entirely. His gaze skittered around the courtroom walls like something cornered. I studied him from the stand and felt nothing. Not pity, not the old volcanic fury either. Only a clear, cold stillness. The stillness of a man who has arrived at the exact right moment to deliver what is owed. The prosecutor came to the stand and asked me to identify myself for the record. I brought my mouth level with the microphone and spoke without a flicker of hesitation. For the following 2 hours, every question they put to me received a precise, measured answer. I walked the court through the full arc of the deception, date by date, step by calculated step. My voice never wavering, my eyes never filling my hands, never once betraying anything resembling distress. Their defense attorney came at me hard, trying to frame me as a billionaire, swinging a grudge like a weapon, but he found nothing to grab onto. I refused to crack. I would not hand my son that victory. The raw facts of what he had done were damning enough on their own. I simply laid them out and let them breathe. Then the prosecutor pivoted away from the defense table and crossed toward the jury box, nodding to the court clerk to bring up the evidence display. The $4 million embezzlement that had initially drawn federal attention to the gala was only the entry point. He went back much further, 15 years back. Up on the screen behind the judge's bench appeared the original deed to my old suburban home, side by side with the power of attorney document that had made the unauthorized sale possible. A certified forensic signature analysis came next. The forgery held up to no scrutiny whatsoever. Standing in front of that silent, rigid courtroom, I laid out in plain language exactly how Derek had engineered it, how he had buried those specific pages inside a towering pile of hospital billing statements and insurance paperwork, delivered to me at my most defenseless, heavily sedated, hollowed out by grief, still in the earliest and darkest days of mourning my wife. I watched 12 jurors receive that information. Several pulled back physically, revulsion moving across their faces before they could contain it. Before them sat the full picture, a cold, premeditated forgery reaching back a decade and a half, locked in beside fresh banking records, laying out exactly where the stolen investor money had gone. The shape of his greed was impossible to misread. He had been taking what wasn't his since the beginning of his adult life, first from a father who was burying his wife, then from business partners who had put their faith in him. Derek's body sank incrementally lower in his seat. He couldn't face the screen, couldn't face the box, couldn't face me. The trial itself was brief. The documentary evidence was simply too dense, too ironclad, too layered with damning corroboration for the defense to meaningfully contest. When the foreman rose to deliver the verdict, the courtroom held its breath so completely the silence felt like a physical weight pressing down on every chest. Guilty on all charges. Those words landed in that room like a vault door swinging shut on a life. The presiding federal judge, a precise, unsparing woman who had built her reputation on zero tolerance for financial crime, arrived at sentencing without mercy. She directed her gaze straight down at Derek and Vanessa, her voice carrying the particular chill of someone who means every syllable. She called what they had done a grotesque exhibition of moral collapse, an act of calculated exploitation that turned family loyalty into a financial instrument. She raised her heavy wooden gavel and drove it down with a crack that bounced off every wall. 15 years in a federal penitentiary. 15 years. The symmetry was almost too precise to be accidental. 1 year of confinement. For each year I had spent clawing my life back from what they had reduced it to. Derek made no sound. He didn't lunge or rage against the bailiffs the way he had on the night of the gala. He just let his head fall forward until his brow connected with the cold metal surface of the defense table. His back caved. The arithmetic was finally reaching him, the true cost of the transaction he had made. He had discarded a guaranteed inheritance, a billion-dollar medical technology empire that would have been his without a single dishonest act. Staggering wealth, forfeited, because $2 million earned through legitimate means had been beneath him. He had traded away his liberty, severed his relationship with his only child, and torched every last thing that might have mattered, and received nothing in return. Quiet settled over the courtroom as the bailiffs moved in. They took Derek by both arms and brought him to his feet. As they turned him toward the door, he sent one last fractured glance back in my direction, but I had already looked away. The account was settled. The peace in me was total. The visiting area of the federal penitentiary was built to make you feel the weight of what had been lost. Overhead, fluorescent tubes cast their flat, buzzing light across rows of scuffed plastic seating and thick plexiglass barriers. I settled into my assigned chair and waited without restlessness. No anxiety, no racing pulse. My heartbeat was even measured unhurried, like the second hand of a clock simply doing its work. I wasn't there seeking absolution to grant or wounds to nurse. I had come to place the final punctuation at the end of an extraordinarily long and painful sentence. A metallic buzz, a heavy click, the steel door across the room came open. A guard walked my son through it. Derek crossed the floor toward the glass partition, and I found myself doing something I hadn't anticipated, struggling for a moment to connect the figure in front of me to the man I had last seen in a bespoke charcoal tuxedo 6 months ago. Now, he wore a faded, ill-fitting khaki jumpsuit hanging loose off his frame. Every line of his body spoke defeat. His shoulders rolled inward. His hair had thinned and grown out ragged, going gray from the temples down. A 15-year sentence had put 10 years on his face in a matter of months. He lowered himself onto the metal stool. His hands unsteady reached for the black plastic telephone receiver. I picked up the handset on my side. Between us, for a stretch of time, there was nothing, only the irregular, labored rhythm of his breathing through the line. His eyes found mine through the scratched plexiglass, swollen and red. Dad, he whispered, his voice giving way on the word. Thank you for coming. I did not think you would ever want to see me again. I said nothing. I let the silence do the work it does, making space that must eventually be filled. He had rehearsed something in that cell. Now was the moment to perform it. He pressed himself toward the glass until his forehead rested against it. I am so sorry, he cried out, the words soaked through with something that sounded like desperation, trying to pass for remorse. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. I lost everything, Dad. I lost my company, my wife, my son. Every night in that cell, I lie awake turning over what I did to you. I just need you to know how truly sorry I am. I sat and absorbed every word of it. The whole thing rang hollow, brittle, and empty, not a trace of genuine feeling underneath. This was the remorse of a man who regretted being caught. Not one syllable of it was for the suffering he had inflicted. I kept my face locked and still giving him nothing, not a flinch, not a flicker. When it became clear that his tear-streaked performance was bouncing off without effect, he wiped his face and shifted gears. The grief evaporated. In its place came something far more familiar, that restless, reaching hunger I had known my whole life. It is so hard in here, Dad. His tone smoothed itself from mourning into grievance without missing a beat. The food is completely inedible. The conditions are terrible. I have absolutely nothing left. They stripped all of my accounts. Caden will not even answer my letters. I am completely alone. He swallowed. Let the silence sit. Then came the look, a needy calculating dressed up as desperation. He stammered that he was only asking for one small thing. Just a modest deposit into his commissary account. Enough for decent food. Basic necessities. You have billions, Dad. A few $100s would mean nothing to you, but in here it would change everything. And there it was, the unvarnished, irreducible truth of who he was. Even stripped of his empire, even staring down 15 years in a federal penitentiary for large-scale financial fraud, the first impulse when he laid eyes on the father he had robbed was to extend his hand. The greed wasn't a choice. It was woven into him at the cellular level, something permanent, something that no verdict or sentence could reach. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't name what he was doing or shame him for the audacity of it. I simply reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and drew out a small silver money clip. Unhurried, deliberate, I worked 2 bills free from beneath the clasp. I held them up close to the plexiglass, near enough that the glare of the fluorescent lights above caught them clearly. 1 crisp 100 bill, 1 crisp $50. Derek stopped mid-whine, his eyes fixed on the money and his brow creased with genuine bewilderment. He watched me fold the 2 bills together with care. I leaned in and fed them through the narrow metal slot at the base of the glass partition. They came to rest on the ledge on his side. Derek looked down, then back up at me, his gaze darting, hunting my face for something that would explain it. Why? The word came out barely above a breath. Why 150 exactly? I held the receiver steady against my ear. Because, Derek, I said, voice flat, perfectly controlled, that is exactly what you left me. I watched it land. I watched his mind travel backward 15 years back to a cold driveway and the sound of locks being changed behind him. He saw himself loading up his car. He remembered walking away from a father, deep in grief, leaving behind nothing but a crumpled wad of bills and a handwritten note that told me to work it out for myself. The poetic precision of the moment buckled something in him. He stared at the $150 resting on that metal ledge. Everything, the public disgrace, the private betrayals, the full catalog of what he had made himself into, seemed to arrive in him at once like a wave that had been building for years. This was not charity. It was a reflection. And what it showed him was monstrous. Derek buried his face in both hands and really broke into hard, uncontrolled weeping. These were not the manufactured tears of his opening performance. This was shame, the genuine and inescapable kind, the kind that arrives when the distance between who you are and who you told yourself you were finally collapses. The reality of 15 years behind those walls settled into him like an anchor dropping. I gave him no parting words. I drew the receiver away from my ear and placed it back on its hook, letting his crying drop away into silence. I rose from the hard plastic chair. I fastened my jacket squared. My shoulders brought my chin level. Then I walked toward the heavy steel exit doors and did not turn back once. My posture was straight, completely unburdened by the ghost of the son I once believed I had. Whatever thread had still connected me to a lifetime of unreciprocated love was now cut clean through. 2 years passed with the quiet, unhurried rhythm of a man finally living by his own measure. I found myself in the front row of a sunlit university arena on a warm graduation morning, the air alive with the particular electric buzz that only that day carries. I wore a well-tailored charcoal suit, hands folded in my lap. I hadn't come as a mogul or a name on a building. I was simply a grandfather who had arrived to watch a young man who had rebuilt himself from nothing. Out across that sea of black caps and flowing gowns, Caden was seated among his classmates. He bore almost no resemblance to the shattered, frightened boy who had crumpled on the steps of a hotel 2 years before. The transformation was total. He had carried a full academic course load while putting in 25 grueling hours a week as a clerk at the $150 Trust My Foundation. His rent, his groceries, his debts, all of it covered by his own hand. He had not asked me for a single dollar since the morning he signed that contract on my front porch. As a hush spread across the arena, the university dean approached the wooden podium to introduce the valedictorian speaker. When Caden's name rang out, something moved through me that I hadn't felt in a very long time, a wave of pride so full it was almost difficult to contain. He climbed to the stage with a steady, purposeful stride. He positioned himself at the microphone and looked out over the assembled crowd without a trace of hesitation. He made no mention of his mother or his father. He did not touch the scandal, the federal charges, or the prison sentences that had dismantled the life he'd grown up in. What he chose to speak about was the brute clarifying weight of reality and what genuine independence actually demands of a person. His grip tightened on the edges of the podium, and his voice carried clear and strong through the arena. He told everyone gathered that the most important lesson of his life hadn't come from any textbook or from any lecture delivered in a prestigious hall. It came, he said, in the form of a push broom and a crumpled 150. He described how effortlessly a person can be imprisoned by the false comfort of privilege, how thoroughly unearned wealth can blind you to everything real. He told the crowd that true survival has nothing to do with finding someone to pull you back up when you fall. True survival, he said, is about finding the absolute internal strength to stand back up on your own 2 feet when nobody else is coming to save you. He paused. Then he looked directly down at the front row and held my gaze. The entire arena seemed to draw a collective breath. He said the man who had saved his life hadn't done it with a generous check or a comforting reassurance. He had done it, Caden told them, by holding a hard line and refusing to let accountability be negotiated away. He smiled wide and real and told that silent crowd that the person who had taught him what a hard-earned dollar truly meant and what self-respect actually costs was his grandfather. The roar that followed was enormous. I sat inside it, feeling a warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing in common with any victory I had ever won in a boardroom. I didn't leap to my feet or call out his name, but the quiet satisfaction running through me in that moment was more complete than anything I had accumulated in a lifetime of building empires. The boy had become a man. When the ceremony wrapped and the manicured lawns outside filled with the cheerful chaos of families and cameras and embracing graduates, I positioned myself near the edge of the stage and waited. Caden made his way through the crowd directly toward me, diploma held firmly in his right hand. He stopped in front of me. No lengthy exchange of words was necessary. Between us there existed a clarity mutual hard-won, built on real respect that needed nothing added to it. A fellow student paused nearby and offered to take our picture. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my grandson and faced the lens. I didn't arrange my expression into anything practiced or polished. For the first time in more than 15 years, a real smile came to my face without my permission. It reached all the way to my eyes. Standing beside that young man in the sunlight, I understood something with total clarity. The wreckage of a deeply poisoned family had finally been scattered to the wind. What stood in its place was something new, a foundation built on honesty on hard edges that did not bend and on a love that had actually been earned. I made my way back to the quiet sanctuary of my private study at the top of the city. The polished walnut desk was bare, except for a single thick leather-bound folder sitting at its center. Clifton waited near the heavy wooden doors, his familiar canvas attaché case at his side. He said nothing as I crossed the room and opened the folder. It was the full annual impact report for the $150 trust. I turned through the crisp pages, slowly letting the sheer scope of what had grown from those early months settle over me. The figures on the page were difficult to absorb all at once. The foundation had funded aggressive legal defense for more than 3,000 elderly people across the country. These were vulnerable men and women being systematically defrauded, manipulated, and cornered by their own families. I read through the detailed case summaries how our network of tenacious attorneys had frozen unlawful asset transfers and clawed back stolen retirement savings. Forged powers of attorney had been challenged and dismantled. Hundreds of abusive relatives were now sitting in cells where they belonged. One case in particular stopped me, a 70-year-old widow locked out of her own home by her daughter. Because our team had moved fast, she was back in her own bed that night while her daughter waited on a federal charge. The pathetic handful of bills my son had left on that kitchen counter had grown into an engine of relentless, unyielding justice. I closed the heavy folder and felt something lift, genuinely lift, from somewhere deep in my chest. I moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows and stood there. The late afternoon sun was pulling long, golden shadows across the skyline, dressing the glass towers in copper and amber. Looking out over that sprawling city, I felt a stillness inside me that was beyond ordinary calm. For 15 years I had carried the suffocating, grinding weight of what my son had done. I had stared at ceilings in the dark, turning over the question of where I had failed as a father, how the child I had raised had calcified into something so cold, so calculating, so willing to leave his own father with nothing. But standing there in the amber light, I arrived at a truth I could no longer argue with. The sickness was never mine to own. Greed is a corrosive terminal disease that certain people make an active choice to feed. I did not ruin my son or his wife. This was never about petty scores settled in the shadows. I stripped away the cushion of my wealth and held an unsparing mirror to what they actually were. I let the consequences they had so carefully arranged for me land squarely on them instead. The diseased branches had been cut from the tree without sentiment, without delay. Because of that painful and necessary surgery, the roots beneath had finally begun to recover. The fortune Derek had worked so hard to steal was now serving as a fortress for thousands of people who had no one else standing in their corner. Clifton came to stand beside me at the glass, looking out at the last of the golden light. He had been my sharpest instrument and my most trusted ally through every dark corridor of this battle. He reached into his canvas attaché case and produced a single clean sheet of paper, setting it carefully on the edge of the polished walnut desk. He met my eyes with the quiet, measured respect of a man who understood the weight of the moment and asked whether I had reached my final decision regarding the board. Was I prepared? He asked to execute the official corporate documents and step down entirely as the active chief executive of my medical technology empire. I turned from the window and looked at the single signature line waiting on that page. I had spent the whole of my adult life in motion, building, accumulating, fighting for survival in an industry that showed no mercy. I had conquered disease in the laboratory. I had driven the parasites out of my own bloodline. My legacy was secure, and I had pointed my grandson toward a future grounded in honest effort and self-reliance. There were no remaining wars demanding my attention, and nothing left to construct. I reached into my jacket's inner pocket, drew out the gold-tipped pen, and pressed it to the paper. My name went down in a single unbroken line, and with it came a stillness that spread through the entire room. I returned the pen to my pocket and looked at Clifton. I told him it was done, the paperwork complete, the transfer of power official. I fastened my jacket and turned once more toward the horizon. I told him that I had spent 74 years surviving, working, and standing guard over everything I had built against people who wore expensive suits and carried knives behind their backs. A real smile, unhurried, genuine, crossed my face. I told him the time for all of that was finished. Now I intended to live. The soft, rhythmic pull of the fly rod was the only thing disturbing the late afternoon quiet. I sat in a weathered wooden chair at the water's edge of a quiet, secluded reservoir, a long distance from the glass towers and the relentless machinery of city life. The setting sun laid a warm copper band across the surface, catching the slow ripples and throwing light across my face. I could feel every line, every crease around my eyes. But for the first time in 15 years, those marks hadn't been put there by sleepless nights or grinding anxiety. They sat in peace, deep-settled, unhurried peace. My phone lay on the wooden dock beside my tackle box screen, black, completely still. No frantic vibrations, no desperate voicemails from a son pleading for $2 million to hold back the tide of federal prosecution. No elaborate fabrications dressed up in the language of family love. The toxic noise that had forced its way into my life and shattered what should have been my quietest years, that noise was gone, permanently. The air out here was sharp and clean, carrying nothing of the desperate greed of a man who had looked at his own father and seen only an account with an expiration date. I sent the line out across the still water and watched the small red bobber come to rest on the glassy surface. I breathed in slowly and let my mind travel the distance between who I was and who I am. 15 years ago, I was standing on a cold concrete driveway, discarded, gutted, barely holding my shape. A grieving widower thrown out like something broken and no longer useful, expected to disappear quietly and cause no further inconvenience. My son and his wife had mistaken my silence for total defeat. They had read my heartbreak as the end of me. What they failed to account for was the one thing about me that had never changed. I do not lay down. I did not merely outlast the cruel game they constructed around me. I took it apart completely. I bought the board. I repositioned the pieces and rewrote every rule of their parasitic little world. I took the worst wound a parent can receive and turned it into armor for thousands of strangers no one else was willing to protect. This was never about noise or spectacle. It was about holding up a mirror steady enough long enough for their own appetite to swallow them. My grandson Caden is right now seated at a modest metal desk somewhere downtown, drawing an honest hourly wage. He pays his own rent each month, manages his own money, and is assembling a life out of actual effort. He comes to me on weekends not with his hand out, but to sit on this same dock and talk through his coursework, his setbacks, and the small victories that feel enormous when you've earned them yourself. He broke the cycle of entitlement that had poisoned the generation before him. He managed it because I refused to hand him a rescue he hadn't worked for. I lost a son to the terminal pull of greed, but I pulled my grandson back from that same edge by offering him the only antidote that actually works reality, unvarnished and unapologetic. I drew the fly rod back slowly, feeling the familiar mechanical resistance of the reel. Far from this quiet reservoir in the heart of the financial district, the grand marble lobby of my foundation stands open. Every single day, thousands of people pass through those glass doors, looking for exactly the protection I once desperately needed myself. They come through those doors shattered and frightened, and they walk out shielded by a battalion of relentless corporate attorneys. Right at the heart of that vast lobby, mounted on a polished black granite pedestal, sits a small reinforced glass display case. Inside, under careful illumination, rests a crumpled 100 bill, a single $50 bill, and a faded yellow sheet of paper. The handwriting, hasty careless, is still perfectly legible after all this time. You will figure it out. That piece of paper no longer belongs in my private study. It belongs to the world now. It stands as a permanent, indestructible monument to every greedy, entitled child who imagines they can plunder the parents who built them and simply vanish without ever facing a reckoning. It stands as a quiet sentinel for the elderly, a reminder that they are not obligated to absorb cruelty from the people who carry their name. I gazed out across the quiet reservoir as the sun slipped below the dark tree line, flooding the sky with deep violet and blue. A cool evening breeze moved across my face, carrying pine and something that smelled unmistakably like freedom. I settled back in my wooden chair, entirely unburdened by what I had once carried. Let that small yellow page stand as a final, unambiguous warning to anyone who looks at a still old man and sees an easy mark. The silence of a betrayed father or a cast-aside grandfather is never surrender. It is not weakness dressed up as acceptance. It is the deep-loaded stillness that gathers before the storm breaks. It is the unhurried, exacting patience of a man waiting for the natural order to right itself. The most enduring truth this ordeal pressed into me is that shared blood gives no one a permanent license to diminish or exploit you. Family is meant to be bedrock, not a garden where entitlement and betrayal are cultivated and passed down. When people show you their true nature by walking away from you at your most broken, you must find the courage to take them at their word. That is where this story ends. Not in a courtroom, not in a prison cell, but on a quiet dock at the edge of a reservoir with a fly rod in my hand and nothing left to prove to anyone. I want to be honest about what this cost. It cost me years. I will never get back. It cost me the version of my son I used to believe in. Carrying that kind of wound for 15 years changes the shape of a person. But I believe God does not waste suffering. And looking at Caden standing on that graduation stage, I can say with certainty that every hard season had a purpose I could not see at the time. If you were somewhere in the middle of your own story, maybe feeling discarded, maybe wondering if the silence of the people who hurt you means they have one, I want to leave you with a few things I learned the hard way. When someone shows you who they are at your lowest moment, believe them completely. Do not negotiate with that truth. Quiet is not the same as finished. The most deliberate moves are the ones made in silence with patience and without an audience. If you want to break a cycle of entitlement in someone you love, the most powerful thing you can hand them is accountability, not a rescue. And never mistake a person's age or grief for the end of their strength. Some of us are just getting started. This has been a family revenge story about what happens when a man refuses to disappear on someone else's schedule. If it moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know, share it with them. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of this hit closest to home. And if you are not already with us, subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories. New stories find their way to you every week. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of the people who have actually earned it.